till that in 2015, 19 Michigan schools' heating and air conditioning systems were controlled by a 1980s Amiga computer that was programmed 30 years prior by a high school student. The former student was still being called upon to repair it if something went wrong. It makes sense to me. This works, and it would cost a lot of money for them to replace the system with something else. I would not be surprised if it is more reliable than a modern computer, because modern computers typically have extremely complicated software that can have glitches in it, which is one reason why software is updated so often, because they got it wrong on their first attempts. With an old system like that, someone might know every line of code that is in it, and they have had time to get it right. One of my previous employers had to use Internet Explorer right up until Microsoft finally ended support last year, as the company Internet was built way back in the late 90s early 00s using ActiveX and other proprietary MS tools that of course only works with E. Last I heard, they've since upgraded to the new MS Edge for the E-compatibility mode, but the company Internet itself is still running on ancient MS software. Snaring face. My high school late 90s had our thermostats controlled by the school board, in another town. There were usually 2 units in each room, occasionally one blasting heat, the other blasting cold, and we could not turn them off or change the temperatures. Classrooms were regularly about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while the hallways were pushing 90 degrees Fahrenheit, because some jerk at the school board thought it was a great idea for them to have control. I'm really curious what the connection topology was for those 19 locations to be controlled by a single computer. Today we think in terms of internet connectivity, but back then it was still very new. My guess is there was some type of modem at each of the 19 schools that piped into the school's telephone switchboard and did periodic check-ins with master control computer, which was also hooked up to a modem. Pretty amusing, but not surprised. In the early 2000s I worked for a major gaming manufacturing company, and the code used for all the wide area of progressive systems was using OpenVMS. This was the predecessor to DOS, I was told, and that the same guy developed VMS and then wrote DOS, or helped. I'm sure it was collaborative. My brother was facing termination in his IT department because he wasn't conversant in the new programs. However, here comes 2000 and all of a sudden, he's an expert in the old programming languages from his army days. So in anticipation of Y2K, everyone's trying to update their systems and he's golden. Reminds me of how our school database was run with absolutely basic security. One of the students got in and deleted my graduation year's transcripts. Now every time I get a job I have to send in a photocopy of my graduation pamphlet and an email from a board member saying I did, in fact, graduate. I was asked to maintain the door access system of our office building. To my surprise, it was running on a very old PC with DOS on it. Worked perfect for that little task alone, but I really hoped no hardware was failing. The 5.2 floppy disk to reboot it had already crumbled. This is what the youth of Reddit who type LOL does anyone still use old tech? Need to understand. There is a shitload of old legacy hardware and software out there still in use. Just because you bought yourself a new phone this year doesn't mean anything. In 2011 and was working for the local county government. The county is 1 million people and they were still using a program that ran on OS/2 to do all their scheduling. The program was used to schedule almost everything, from court cases to summer camps. So an Amiga will function for 30 years? But my modern computer becomes useless in 5 years because the graphics card is no longer able to keep up. And I can't swap it out because it's integrated into the motherboard? Mother something, I'll tell you. Meanwhile, a school in my state wasted thousands because nobody could figure out how to shut the lights off on their fancy new integrated electrical system. I was surprised when this made the news, but I shouldn't have been. Older tech is run into the ground by organizations unless they see good reason to upgrade. Lowe's was using an ancient user interface for the registers till they upgraded in 2021 or so. Reminds me of my dad's old hospital. The entire place basically ran on a singular pirated CD of Windows 98, which he set up. I find it funny that my dad was basically the hospital's IT guy in the 90s, because when shit goes down, they call him. As a computer programmer, I can safely say this never happens nowadays. Instead we're asked to fix software we had nothing to do with that was clearly coded by thousands of monkeys with typewriters, in addition to software we wrote years ago. Many HVAC systems don't function this well with modern equipment. If it ain't broke, don't fix it comes to mind. Plus every year that it goes on, the chance of a better tech is that much higher that will cost less and have more stability. Something people never seem to realize about computers: a computer that did a specific job 30 years ago is still capable of doing the same job today. The controller doesn't need to do a lot. It's only using a fraction of its power. Happens all the time at the university I work. Student will build a system, run it during the time they're enrolled, and then when they leave shit hits the fan. Last one I heard about were the servers for the security program. First paragraph, it gets even better. A 30-year-old computer that has run day and night for decades is what controls the heat and air conditioning at 19 Grand Rapids public schools. Like a modern-day brave little toaster. There was also a case of an old NetWare server at a university that had been accidentally sealed behind drywall during a remodel but kept dutifully doing its job for many years even though nobody knew where it was. Go Commodore! I found out that I'm distantly related to one of the bigwigs from that company, but it's nothing really to be proud of since the fucking place ended up run into the ground. But this story is nice. I went to school in this district. They once had to pass an emergency mileage tax to keep the heat on in the winter. So not surprised they never upgraded. They barely had money for paper when I went there. You might be surprised how many industrial control facility related control systems are run on archaic IT systems. It's one of the reasons the cybersecurity of US infrastructure is such a big concern. I remember hearing in high school that our HVAC systems were controlled somewhere in Wisconsin. I went to SU High in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm going to check the list now. Takes $2 million to replace with the current system? Why can't you replace this with a Raspberry Pi? Unless the new system will have a boatload more sensors to take into consideration. As a big fan of the Amiga, I consider that further evidence that those machines were ahead of their time. Now pardon me while I go pull up a GIF of the iconic bouncing ball. I have a vague memory of an IBM PC that was accidentally built into a wall by renovation at a university, and it ran for years before someone realized it wasn't accessible. So is that guy charging like $1,000 hour as a consulting fee? Seems like it's such a niche but important thing where only he knew the code. He could probably name his price. I cut my programming teeth on an Amiga in the 1980s, and ended up having a lifelong career as a programmer as a result. But no, it was not me that programmed this one. You'd be surprised how many companies are using equipment software this old just because it would cost $X millions to replace it, if the replacement is even available. Hey, I designed this product for you. Can you teach us how to service it? Yes, for money. What if we just pay you when we need your help? We could that too. This is sadly more common. In 2009, I was an intern for a school district and they used a Windows 3.1 computer that ran all the district's clocks and alarms. I still have my Amiga 2000 HD sitting behind me. It isn't running because I have to replace the CMOS battery, but damn, that is great to hear practical use. Michigan, how you don't run shit. For real, Flint and all those towns have been suffering since the 80s. Source: I saw Roger and me in 10th grade. Having watched my company retire a Commodore 64 that was running a door case white block in 1999 not Y2K compliant is unsurprising. $2 million to replace it, government bloat. Can't believe that they can't come up with something to replace it for any less than that. Turns out we might have not been as hydraulics as we thought. Was pretty sure that AC was on during winters and summer the heat was on. We had software like that for reading industrial meters. 30 years old and it still works better than what it was replaced with. You should probably stop complaining about your intermittent water pressure. Your infrastructure could always be worse. I don't get it. Was it something in the water or leaving in the air there that made people do stupid shit like this? Yeah, I would be very surprised how old most of the industrial controls sector infrastructure really is. I've run one of my work computers 15 years. Only reboot when power went out and battery backup died. 30 years? God damn it, people. The term "if it's not broke don't fix" is a metaphor. Upgrade tech, people. A lot of the software infrastructure we use is very brittle even for some pretty important things. If this seems crazy, don't ever look into the systems behind our critical national infrastructure. Modern problems require modern solutions. What an engineering chat for fixing things in his area. A new computer would cost between $1.5 million to $2 million because someone is going to grift between $1.5 million to $2 million. When I graduated in 1990, none of the schools I attended up to that point had air conditioning. I'm an engineer in the HVAC and controls space. This surprises me a lot less than it should. Sure, a lot of people that don't know about bus factor when talking about not replacing it. Michigan is always in the news for just the worst shit. I promise you guys it's nice up here. I still receive calls from a client I had 18 years ago to ask questions about her Netscape. Wait until the op finds out the Apollo missions to the moon were controlled by an abacus. If it's work, don't change it. Or maybe because there's no budget to upgrade the system, and no guru meditation in all that time? Here's another one for you. Like 90 of Michigan schools don't have air conditioning. Lol. This is way more common than you would think. Not as extreme as 30 years, but still. Send this over to our Arduino, they'd have an open source solution ready in no time. You'd be shocked how often stuff like this happens. If it ain't broke and all. I used to sell Amigas when they first rolled out. The musicians loved them. Guaranteed dude's still maintaining it, his price still only getting paid like $30. Not surprised. Sabre is still being used in airports and travel companies. I sure hope they distinct paid him well for his services all this time. Definition of a legacy system? Only ICBM control systems can compete. BTW. Does anyone know if the schools are still using the Amiga? As someone who works in schools, this seems all too real to me. Bank of America entire company runs on mainframes using COBOL. I'm surprised it was able to continuously run for that long. No high school teacher in 19 schools knew basic programming. This explains why it was so cold in winter every year. That could also be a typical example for a German school. It works for the nuclear arsenal, why not some schools?